Ambassador Bolton. Lou Lateef has the distinction that is above all, he's married to Najla, and he is teasing there. When we go down to Naples for our events, the last time he picked up Phyllis and I, he just referred to himself as the chauffeur, driving us around to all our events. But Lou's final position in a long career with Ford, very successful executive, was as the president of Ford Europe. He came after that and was the dean of the business school at Boston University, which would be impressive enough, except during his tenure there, they had extraordinary growth in both the quality of the faculty and the facilities and all. He is really one of the great executives and leaders in business, and he's been a friend, he and Najla, a friend of Phyllis for, decades and decades now, and I'm very grateful for his encouragement to all of us at Eagle Forum and all of our work, and I'd like to introduce you to Lou Lateef. Lou?
Thank you, Ed. That was very generous. A little brief, I thought. Since this is a crowd of John Bolton admirers and enthusiasts, it could be fairly said he needs no introduction. You all know Ambassador Bolton from his several past visits to Phyllis Schlafly's Eagle Council, and you know him to have been the United States Permanent Representative to the United Nations for a year and a half under President George W. Bush. Prior to that assignment, he served for 4 years as Undersecretary of State for Arms Control and International Security, and in 2006 he was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. You may not know that he's a Maryland native, the son of a fireman. He attended Yale University and graduated in 1970 summa cum laude. He went on to earn his J.D. at Yale Law School with his friend Clarence Thomas. By the way, at Yale Law School, he was also a contemporary of Bill and Hillary Clinton, but he's managed to overcome that relationship. He's had a lifetime of public service. Beside his stints at the State Department, he also served as Assistant Attorney General in the Justice Department. Ambassador Bolton is today a Senior Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, a Senior Advisor for Freedom Capital Investment Management, a Fox News commentator, and he serves as counsel to the prominent D.C. law firm Kirkland & Ellis. As a young college student, John Bolton was already a serious conservative thinker. Even in high school, he had run the Students for Goldwater campaign. All these years later, he's one of the most articulate, scholarly voices in America espousing conservative principles that would elevate all Americans, strengthen our sovereignty, and make the world saner and safer. It's no wonder he was one of our beloved Phyllis Schlafly's favorites for Secretary of State in a Trump administration. Importantly, he's again made time to be with us at Phyllis's Eagle Council. Looking forward to his always clear-minded insights, please join me in welcoming Ambassador John Bolton.
Well, thank you very much. I'm glad to be with all of you today. I must say, when I was invited some months back to attend, I was happy to agree and was looking forward to seeing Phyllis. She has been an inspiration to me, as I'm sure to many in this room, for a long time. I was involved in the Goldwater campaign in 1964. I was very young then. But I remember her book. I still have a copy of it, A Choice Not an Echo, when she was in the thick of the fight to elect Barry Goldwater that, of course, the national news media said was a hopeless cause, and the philosophy behind it was hopeless. In fact, it was all hopeless. Why don't we just give up and go home? And Phyllis never did that. She took on the hardest fights there were. Sometimes she won, sometimes she lost, but she never lost heart. And she was an inspiration in everything she did, and she'll be an inspiration even now that she's passed. And I can't think of a more opportune moment to be with all of you in her memory than with one of the most consequential elections that we're ever going to face in front of us. Look, it's been hard on the conservative side as we've gone through the nomination process. With 17 candidates, it's probably not anything unexpected that we had a lot of division, a lot of people supporting different candidates and so on. But obviously we had large numbers of people speak in the primaries and caucuses, and we've got a nominee. And the fact is that very few things in life are perfect. Maybe nothing in life is perfect. And everything comes down to a choice. That's what politics is all about. I think this choice is very clear and very easy. As you just heard, I was in law school. I was a year behind Hillary and Bill. And I like to say that I've been burdened with them 20 years longer than the rest of the country. I don't need any arguments on this score at all. When I knew Hillary then, and don't get me wrong, we weren't drinking buddies, but she was a radical in law school, and I think whatever you are that time of life, whether you're in grad school or law school or whatever you're doing, that's pretty much where you are. Make no mistake, she will say anything it takes to get elected, but during the Democratic nomination process, she didn't have to strain hard to get to Bernie Sanders' left. She was already there. All she had to do was say what she actually thought anyway. And she will be, not just on national security matters, but on domestic matters as well, she will be Obama's third term. And we're barely getting through his 2 terms. He knows exactly, Obama does, why Hillary needs to be elected. He's said it publicly. He actually speaks very boldly if you listen to him carefully. He described this election as comparable to electing George H.W. Bush in 1988, in effect to be Reagan's third term, to help lock in, at least over a certain time horizon, the dramatic changes that Reagan had made, and Obama expects Hillary to lock in the changes he's made. My worry is that it's going to be even worse. We've got the first debate between the 2 candidates coming up on the 26th of September. Given where we are now, I think it will be an incredibly important moment in the campaign. I'd just like to spend a few minutes talking about what I see as the legacy of Obama's 8 years in office and why we need a critical debate on national security so that the people can judge who's going to be the best commander-in-chief in what are very, very perilous times. And I will say, I understand completely, of course, that there are a lot of significant issues in this election, economic issues, social issues, all the things that activists like you are very familiar with. But I would say that the predominant issue for me is always national security, because after all, if our country is not safe, all of our other freedoms are imperiled. And that's why the contrast, I think, between the nominees couldn't be clearer. I would describe the environment we're in now as one that has 2 imminent threats that the country faces and 2 that are strategic. It's a complicated world, but the highlight is right now we face 2 imminent threats on a daily basis. The threat of radical Islamic terrorism, number 1, and the threat of the proliferation of nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons, number 2. And the real risk that those 2 come together in a perfect storm where we have another 9/11 attack on our country, not with hijacked airplanes, but with weapons of mass destruction, which would make the casualty figures obviously far more terrible. The radical Islamic threat, we know today, is more severe than it was on September the 10th, 2001. We know that from the evidence we see around us, but we know it from testimony in open session of Congress by the Obama administration's top intelligence officials, people nominated by Barack Obama himself, who have said that the threat has continued to grow. So when we look around at the attacks that we have seen in Western Europe, the attacks we've seen in the United States over the past several years, when we see that the radical ideology continues to spread, continues to metastasize, when we see the waves of refugees coming out of the chaos around the Middle East, there's no doubt that this threat is continuing to grow. It's not a threat that we have seen the likes of before. It's not a nation state, at least not yet. And it doesn't follow a corporate or government organizational chart. That doesn't make it easier to handle. It makes it harder to handle. And we've got not only an administration in power, but a presidential candidate on the Democratic side who simply doesn't recognize that we're facing, once again, a hostile ideology, an ideology that's grown out of a particular religion. They don't want to talk about it that way because they think that it denigrates Muslims all around the world. In fact, it's Muslims who have been the principal victims in terms of sheer numbers of this radical terrorism. King Abdullah of Jordan, who's not just the Muslim king of a Muslim country, but a descendant of the keepers of the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, has described this as a civil war within Islam, as to which side is ultimately going to be dominant in the religion. I think that's a pretty good description. I mean, for goodness sakes, if it's good enough for King Abdullah, why isn't it good enough for Barack Obama? We've got to treat it like an ideology. We've got to treat it with a comprehensive strategy. We've got to destroy the terrorist bases where they exist, in ISIS and the caliphate they're trying to establish, not to sacrifice the gains that we've won at such high cost in Afghanistan in defeating Taliban and al-Qaeda. These terrorists are shifting all over the broader Middle East, and in fact, one of the legacies of the Obama administration that goes beyond terrorism is that we have moved from a circumstance in Africa and the Middle East where we've got a crisis in country A or a crisis in country B to the entire sweep of territory from Morocco on the Atlantic Ocean to Pakistan in South Asia that's descending into chaos. Country after country is literally coming apart, and in the anarchy that emerges, terrorist groups, thugs, traffickers in persons and drugs and weapons of mass destruction are springing up. And in large measure, the American withdrawal that Obama believes in has helped contribute to that. So the terrorist threat continues. Hillary Clinton doesn't understand it's an ideology, doesn't think we're at war with them, thinks that it's still a law enforcement matter. You know, after the terrorists kill 40 or 50 people, you arrest them, you prosecute them, and put them in jail. What's the problem? What's the problem? Well, the problem is it's just going to keep getting worse. And so I think these are the questions that need to be put to her and to Trump to hear what their strategies are. I think Trump has indicated what his are. The contrast to me on this issue couldn't be greater. On nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons, the Obama administration, in signing the deal with Iran on their nuclear weapons program, has committed, to me, the greatest act of diplomatic appeasement in American history. This was a catastrophic strategic decision by Obama, and it's a reflection not just of his worldview, but of the same worldview shared by Hillary Clinton. And that is that one of the principal causes of instability in the world is the United States. That we're so strong, so assertive, so successful, that other countries reacting to that engage in behavior that we then take as threatening. And when we respond by protecting our citizens and our vital interests, that just incites them to more violence. So if we withdrew from the world, it would be a safer place, because the Ayatollahs in Tehran would feel so much more secure that they'd give up their nuclear weapons program. And Kim Jong-un, the third and the only hereditary communist dictatorship in world history, would give up his nuclear weapons program. And terrorists would go back to weaving baskets and farming. I mean, this is the view that the threats that we see are actually inspired by the United States. So how do you deal with the mullahs in Tehran who are moving toward a deliverable nuclear weapons capability, something they've sought since the Islamic Revolution of 1979? Well, you make a deal with them that eliminates all of the economic sanctions, that turns over $150 billion in frozen assets, that gives them every access to American financial and other markets. And really, what could go wrong? And we've seen in just a year and a half exactly what could go wrong. They've taken the frozen assets and are using them for terrorism, for their nuclear weapons program, and who knows what else. They have not modified their behavior in the broader world at all. They've taken more American hostages. They've threatened our friends and allies in the Middle East and around the world. They remain the world's central banker of international terrorism. They're violating the nuclear deal on a daily basis. And each week that goes by, we learn of some other concession that Obama made to get this deal. Most graphically recently, the cash for hostages aspect of the deal. Now, the Obama administration will say, well, that was all purely coincidental. It was separate. It wasn't part of the nuclear deal. And by the way, it really wasn't cash for hostages. Just consider this chronology. Implementation day of the nuclear deal was January the 16th of this year. That afternoon, the Iranian news service announced that the hostages would be freed. But they didn't leave until they had word that the plane, the Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps plane with pallets full of cash, was in the air headed for Tehran. Now, this is all purely coincidental. So if you believe this, there are lots of bridges around this country that are for sale. Hillary Clinton believes in this deal. She laid the foundations for it when she was Secretary of State. Her only regret is that John Kerry ultimately got to make the last concession, and she was already out of office. She has not moved 1 inch away from this deal because she believes in it. She believes, as I say, that this is how you protect America in times of trouble. And it's a fundamentally misguided worldview. We've seen it play out in any number of instances around the world, in addition to the Iran nuclear deal. I'm terribly afraid that at the opening of the UN General Assembly, which takes place in New York this coming week, President Rouhani of Iran is going to speak for Iran a few days after Obama speaks. I'm afraid that Obama is finally going to get what he's wanted all along, which is a public handshake with a man who has blood on his hands from the terrorist activity that Iran finances and that's trying to build nuclear weapons to threaten the United States, Israel, and other American friends around the world. We should ask Hillary, if that handshake takes place, whether she would have done the same if she gets elected. Now, these are the imminent threats. They're threats that we confront on a daily basis. But we have strategic threats as well that Obama's policies, which were shepherded and developed by Hillary for the 4 years she was Secretary of State, threaten us as well. First, with Russia, which remains a strategic threat to the United States in Europe and in the Middle East. The Russians have done something that we said in 1945 we would never allow to happen again on the continent of Europe, which is that they have used military force to change international boundaries in Georgia, in Ukraine. They are threatening similar activities elsewhere, particularly the Baltic republics, who are deeply worried about the withdrawal of American interest in and concern for their safety, which is our safety as well. We've seen Putin simply annex the Crimea, taking it away from Ukraine. He's met with a few ineffectual Western sanctions that are crumbling even as we speak. There's more coming there. Putin has done even better in some senses in the Middle East. You know, up until a year or so ago, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia had one military base, one, that was not in the territory of the former Soviet Union. That was their naval station at Tartus in Syria. Now, under Obama, they've built an extensive air base at Latakia, a few minutes flying time from Israel's northern border. They are extending their influence and their alliance with Iran and the axis of Iranian influence through the puppet regime in Baghdad, controlled by officers of the Revolutionary Guards Corps from Iran, to the Assad regime in Syria, Hezbollah in Lebanon. This is something that's put our friends in the region at great peril. But The Russians are continuing to make progress there because they see in Obama a figure of weakness. They don't want military confrontation with the United States, but they're going to push us just as far as they can, wherever they can, until they see pushback. You can see it all around the world. In the Baltic Sea a few months ago, their fighters were flying within 20 feet of American naval vessels. Any of you who have been in either service know that at that speed, 20 feet is no feet at all. We could have had American blood because of the dangerous tactics of those Russian flyers, but they've been doing it in naval maneuvers with China. Think of that, in the Eastern Mediterranean, and now in the South China Sea. And they're going to continue to do it because they can get away with it. Nobody is watching more carefully what the Russians are doing in Eastern and Central Europe than Beijing, because in their part of the world, they don't even confront an alliance like NATO. They see a hub-and-spoke series of alliances between the United States, Japan, the United States, South Korea, United States, and Australia. And the Chinese are making belligerent territorial claims in the East and South China Sea that would, in effect, take what are now international waters and make them into Chinese lakes. You know, the Chinese have already declared a provincial capital for the South China Sea. And you've seen the pictures in your newspapers. They're not just creating facts on the ground, as we like to say in the Middle East. They're creating the ground. They're building islands, and they're putting naval and air bases on them to extend the reach of Chinese military capabilities. China's engaged in one of the biggest defense buildups in contemporary times. They're expanding their ballistic missile and nuclear weapons forces. They're building a blue water naval capability, which for China, this is the first time in 600 years they have tried to do this. They have one of the most sophisticated cyber warfare programs on the planet. They've got extensive anti-satellite capabilities to blind our assets in space in time of conflict. They've got what are called area denial, anti-access missile systems designed to push the United States Navy back from the shores of the Western Pacific, where we've been dominant since 1945. And they're doing it with precious little attention by the United States, despite the so-called pivot to Asia that Obama announced to get away from the Middle East, where his policies had been so resolutely successful. So everywhere we look around the world, at the immediate level of threats from terrorism and nuclear proliferation to the more strategic level, we see ourselves effectively under pressure and in retreat. Not because somehow we have fallen behind, not because we don't have the capabilities granted after a pathetically weak economic recovery after the last 8 years under Obama's policies, but we find ourselves in trouble because of our own actions, because of our own retreat from positions of strength, not just military strength, but political and economic strength that have been built up over decades. Because we've forgotten what Ronald Reagan taught us, that the way to avoid conflict is not to engage in weakness, but to demonstrate strength, to create structures of deterrence that dissuade potential adversaries from taking the first step. Obama's view is that a weaker America will lead to a more secure world. This is like looking through the wrong end of a telescope. He's just wrong. It is not a strong America that's provocative. It's a weak America that's provocative. And Obama... Obama, in this connection, is not an aberration. Whether Hillary was their nominee, Joe Biden, John Kerry, the policies would be the same, because there is no national security wing in the Democratic Party anymore. There is no Scoop Jackson wing. There isn't even a Joe Lieberman wing in the Democratic Party anymore. And honestly, nothing demonstrates the coincidence of Obama and Hillary's views more, or the failings of those views, than the incident that they would do anything they could to make us forget. And here we are just a few days after September the 11th, but obviously I'm thinking of the September 11, 2012 attack in Benghazi. This was a symbol of failure on the part of the United States, the magnitude of whose consequences cannot be calculated. A tragedy to have 4 Americans murdered, to be sure, but in strategic terms, a loss to the United States, the effects of which we're still feeling. Essentially, every aspect of Benghazi, before the attack, during the attack, and after the attack, was mishandled. Mishandled before the attack because there was ample warning that our people in Libya generally were in trouble. We had to evacuate official Americans from Libya in early 2011 as Gaddafi was being overthrown. It was the right thing to do. It was not tenable for them to be there. And you know how we evacuated them from Tripoli, the capital? Did the United States Navy sail in to get them out? No. The United States of America, under Barack Obama, rented a Greek ferry boat to come across the Mediterranean and extract our people, fortunately without incident and without casualties. There's simply no question that we were on notice that as the Islamic radicalism continued to spread, that not just official Americans, but all Americans, private citizens, business people, tourists, people doing missionary work were in jeopardy all across the Middle East. And nobody in the Obama administration paid any mind to it, because if they had, they would have had to admit that their narrative that there was no war on terrorism would be disproven. So that in the run-up to that 9/11, no plans were made, no protections were taken. Now, Hillary says, well, but I had experts at the State Department who do diplomatic security, and I relied on them. So it's not my fault. Let me just tell you, I've worked for 6 different secretaries of state, people of very different backgrounds and experience. Not one of them would have failed to pay attention to the threat to the people working for them, the people for whom they were responsible, who were in danger in countries like Libya. Libya is not the same as Belgium or Iceland. The threat level that the Americans faced was different, and it should have had the attention of the Secretary of State. On 9/11 itself, the response was pathetic, and let's forget, it was not simply an attack in Benghazi. The American embassy compound in Sana'a, the capital of Yemen, was breached by al-Qaeda. In Cairo, the American embassy compound was breached by al-Qaeda. They raised al-Qaeda's black flag over the embassy. The embassy was attacked in Tunis and Tunisia as well. We didn't see any of these attacks coming. And any prudent person would have said, with that kind of intelligence failure, we don't know the extent of the attacks that are about to follow. It was not correct to say that we couldn't have gotten assets to Benghazi fast enough. We don't know the answer to that question, but no assets were put in motion. And not knowing what could have gone on through the night in other capitals around the region or what would have happened the next day, it was purest fortune, good fortune, that we didn't have more casualties. And on the night of September the 11th itself, Hillary Clinton had one conversation with the President of the United States, one, to talk about the famous Mohammed video. During the entire day, she had no conversations with the Secretary of Defense. Now, the 6 secretaries of state that I worked for would have been on the phone to their counterpart at the Defense Department about every half an hour saying, what are we doing? What are we doing? What can we do? And worst of all, she went home that night. She went home. She left the State Department with Americans under fire. Now she says, but the telephones work. Look, this is the equivalent of a Navy commander leaving the bridge of his ship under attack and going to his stateroom and saying, keep me posted on how it's going. It's inexcusable. I can tell you, when the Secretary of State stays through the night, you better be there too. When the Secretary goes home, it's a clear signal that there's nothing they plan to do. I regard it as leaving the scene of her duty station in an inexcusable way. And then in the aftermath of Benghazi, what was the response of the Obama administration? They prosecuted one person. They got one person to bring back to the United States to give a full due process criminal trial. One. So what's the lesson of Benghazi, and particularly Hillary Clinton's leadership in that crisis? The lesson is that under Obama and Clinton, you can assassinate the president's personal representative in a country and do it with impunity. And that's a lesson for the terrorists, for the state sponsors of terror, for our adversaries all around the world, that we're dealing with a very weak America indeed. So there are those who say that Vladimir Putin actually wants Donald Trump to be president. I think he wants Hillary Clinton to be president. If he wants anybody, he wants another weak American president. And so that's why I think as citizens, we've got a very, very important decision in our hands here. I just say again, I understand entirely how strongly people in this room feel about a range of issues that you've worked on, and rightly so, for many years. But the safety of our country always has to be the principal issue, because if we're not safe, everything else is in jeopardy. And 4 more years, or I don't even want to think about 8 more years of the policies we've been pursuing, are going to leave us and our children and grandchildren in terrible jeopardy. I know where Phyllis Schlafly was on this election. She never hid her opinion. She always felt strongly about it. And I think that she's told us what we need to do here for the next 6 or 7 weeks, and I know everybody in this room will do it. Thank you very much. So, thank you very much. Thank you very much. I don't want to put you any further behind than we already are, but I would be happy to answer a few questions until they pull the hook here. And we've got a microphone coming around. We'll try and do at least a couple. Yes, sir.
Would you comment on the Muslim militia buildup in this country and also in Mexico near our border?
Well, I don't think there's any question that the massive flow of refugees out of particularly the conflict in Syria, but more broadly across North Africa and the Middle East, has been a cover for terrorists to get into this country, in Europe as well. I think that we can't really know the full extent of it. But just as an example, last year when Chancellor Merkel of Germany, very unwisely in my view, agreed to accept 800,000 refugees from Syria, which is now probably about 1.5 million. Nobody really knows accurately, but at the time she said 800,000. One of the ministers in the Lebanese cabinet said he estimated that roughly 2% of those refugees would be terrorists. So you do the math, and that's a mere 16,000 terrorists from that number. And once they're in Europe, they're a lot closer to the United States than you might think. Moreover, you point to the risk of the terrorists coming in through Mexico, and it's a route that sadly they are very familiar with. You know, even the Obama administration brought an indictment, it's about 3 years ago now, against senior figures in the Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps for a plot to assassinate the Saudi ambassador to the United States in a restaurant in Washington. And they were going to come into this country along with the traffickers in persons bringing the illegal immigrants in, because they knew it was a very safe and reliable way to get in. So whatever your views on the broader issue of immigration, there's no doubt in my mind that we face a substantially enhanced threat from terrorists coming in, along with the illegals and the drug traffickers and everything else. And it's not just individual terrorists that I worry about. You know, we tend to focus on the threat of a nuclear weapon being delivered by an Iranian ICBM or a North Korean ICBM, let's not forget the equally horrible prospect of bringing in a nuclear weapon across the border, reassembling it somewhere in the United States, putting it in a truck, and driving it into Times Square. Very possible, very possible. So this issue of the security of the borders from the terrorist perspective and the nuclear perspective is extremely real. You can barely find Hillary Clinton commenting on it. Yes, ma'am.
I'm right
here.
here.
I beg your pardon, yes.
My husband is German, and we were in Germany this summer for 2 weeks in the month of June. We discovered that it was 1.1 million last year they brought in, 800,000 this year. And the Germans are saying themselves that 70% of these are young, physically fit, military-age male. As soon as they arrive in their camps, half of them disappear. So it's like they already know they're going to go off to some mosque to be trained. Who knows where they're going? And I am so worried the same thing is going to be happening here. There's no way that we can possibly vet these people, just like Germany could not vet them.
Yeah.
Just wanted your comments.
No, I think the Europeans have made a very, very substantial mistake. And I have to say I was an admirer of Chancellor Merkel for many, many reasons up until these decisions on the admission of the refugees, because although in theory refugee status is temporary, when the conflict is over, the refugees are supposed to return to their country of origin, nobody's going back. And the Europeans do not have our melting pot tradition. They're not good at assimilation. They're going to face a problem that the magnitude of which they can't judge. But I think we risk the same problem in this country. We've seen it with in Britain in the terrorist attacks of 2007, which were carried out by Muslim radicals who were born and raised in the United Kingdom. They saw every advantage of a free society, and they still turned away from it. And that risk is something that, unless we take more seriously, we're simply going to see the dangers to perfectly innocent people in this country continue. And as I say, the horror that I worry about is beyond just a suicide bomber who has an explosive vest on. I worry about a suicide bomber who's got a nuclear weapon that they're prepared to detonate. This is something that we took seriously after 9/11. It's a sad commentary that 15 years later, we've all but, under the last 8 years in particular, we've all but forgotten the threat, and it's something we've got to get back. Otherwise, the unfortunate reality is it's going to take another disaster to focus our attention again, and I desperately hope that's not what it turns out to be. Okay?
Ambassador Bolton, about 3 years ago, I had the opportunity to ask you a question regarding, at the Eagle Forum, regarding our relationship with Putin, and I asked whether or not we should be looking to work more closely with him. Now, since that time, things have got progressively worse. The snake is out of the basket. What would your advice be to a President Trump regarding Putin?
Look, there are areas where we can work with Putin in terms of Islamic terrorism. There are areas where we can work with him. But his view of Russia's strategic interest is contrary to ours. We're not going to work with them effectively to deal with ISIS in Syria and Iraq because we have very different views of what the outcome is that we want. Putin is somebody who focuses, and I've been in meetings with him several times, with our president and Secretary Powell, Secretary Rumsfeld. When people say he's an alumnus of the KGB and try and explain what that means, all I can say is, if you've ever seen him up close, he's one of the toughest people you have ever met. He has no compunction about doing what he needs to do to protect Russian interests. In the Middle East, one of those interests is protecting the Assad regime in Syria. And we've seen 5 years of our government convinced that we can deal with the Russians and get Assad out of power. It will never happen. Will never happen. And he may attack ISIS, which suits us, but to protect Assad, not to help ease Assad out. So I think you've got to be very compartmentalized in your mind when you're president. Dealing with somebody like Assad, you can deal with him on some issues. and we should. We did deal with them effectively on some issues. On some issues, you can't. And it's a mistake to engage in the same kind of mirror imaging that the State Department engages in all the time, to say, we're reasonable people, we want to find a solution. He must be a reasonable person too. Guess again. You know, he's got different interests, and he'll pursue them. So my view of Putin hasn't changed. You know, I wish we had done better in the Bush administration to bring him closer to us. We tried. He clearly has a different view. It's certainly true in the space of the former Soviet Union, where he's trying to reestablish Russian hegemony. You know, he said 10 years ago, the last time he was president, the breakup of the Soviet Union is the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. I mean, that tells you something. Most of us think the breakup of the Soviet Union was a pretty good way to end the 20th century, but that's not his view. So this is, you know, I have no doubt what Hillary Clinton would say on the subject. This is the Secretary of State who gave her Russian counterpart the reset button. Nice work. That really worked out. So I think this is a very important subject. I wouldn't confine it just to Russia. I think, if anything, given the size of the country and its economic growth, it's obviously China that will be our biggest strategic problem in the 21st century, and something that we barely talked about in the presidential contest so far. Why don't we take maybe one more? Yes, sir. Okay. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you so much, Ambassador, for your service to us and to helping us be a strong nation. There are governments changing in Brazil, France, and London. What do you see as coming out of those changes?
Well, in the case of Brazil, those who know the new president well think that he'll be a distinct improvement over his two leftist predecessors. Brazil is a very interesting country. You know, they have a saying down there. They say, Brazil is the country of the future and always will be. So this is a problem that they recognize themselves. Unfortunately, because of Brazil's size and history, they spend a lot of time defining themselves by what they're not. Namely, they're not the United States. And I would love to find ways to convince them that they ought to think more about how to work with us. It's not going to be anything that happens overnight. But it is not a country we'd like to see hostile to our interests the way it has been in the past. In France, it's going to be a very interesting election, and you can see in France the feeling of so many people that they've lost control of their country. They've lost control of their borders. They don't recognize the France that's beginning to emerge. Nicolas Sarkozy is running again for his party's nomination. He had been written off. He is the French president, I think, since World War II, who is most pro-American. So if I'm afraid, if there are media here, I'm afraid of saying I hope he wins, because I wouldn't want to hurt his chances. But I think it would be very significant from the U.S. perspective if he were to win. You know, in Great Britain, we've had not just a change of leader with Theresa May becoming the second conservative female British Prime Minister, but obviously Britain's referendum vote to leave the European Union. And I should say I was there on June the 23rd. This is an issue I've followed for a long time. I strongly supported Brexit. I think it was the right thing for them to do. It was a historic occasion to see them do it. Now Theresa May's got to figure out how to negotiate Britain's departure, but I think it'll be an incredibly important thing for them and for the United States to preserve representative government and sovereignty, and not to surrender more of their power to Brussels the way we have surrendered so much of ours to Washington over the years. The circumstances are obviously different, but the people in Britain felt very strongly about it. And I had a conversation a couple weeks ago with a conservative member of the House of Commons, somebody I've known for a long time on these European Union issues, And he coincidentally, I called him a day or two after Theresa May's first question period in Commons. You know, their practice is the opposition gets to question the Prime Minister. They have it on television now, like we have C-SPAN. It's fascinating to watch. It's a different political culture, but it's close enough to us that it's good entertainment. And it's something that in political Britain is very important, how a prime minister does. And this friend of mine said that this was, as I say, Theresa May's first question period. He said he was reminded of Margaret Thatcher. So I took great heart from that. And, you know, they often say that political trends in Britain and the United States track each other very closely. So Margaret Thatcher was elected prime minister in 1979. In 1980, we elected Ronald Reagan. We'll see if it happens again. Thank you very much. Good luck to you.
Thank you, Ambassador. He does have to run, so he's going to, don't forget that book there, that's yours. But he has to run, so if you didn't get a picture, you're going to be lost. Before we finish, I would like you to stay standing and clapping because I want to make sure everybody that knows we make an announcement. On October 27th in Franklin, Tennessee, America's Future, which is an organization, a 501c3 organization that Phyllis was the secretary and treasurer of, I think, General, and he is the president of the board. A group that started in 1948, I think, that does promotes American exceptionalism, the market system, and just all great things. And we'll be in Franklin, Tennessee for a dinner, and it won't be honoring him because we've already honored him, but he'll be hosting us. But General Jack Singlaub, I mentioned earlier, who was one of the founders. Well, before there was a CIA and OSS, there just were guys that were saving America in World War II, and he's a great hero, and he's right over here. If you haven't shook his hand, you better make sure to, because it's one of the greatest American soldiers ever in our history. He fought in World War II, France and Japan, and then Korea, Vietnam, everywhere there was. So thank you for being here, General. He's a great friend of Phyllis, too. Great friend of Phyllis.